Onward, ever onward. There were deckhands everywhere on the harbour side, shouting orders, running, bustling, and we were told there were no shortage of work for us to do, loading up little boats with boxes and barrels of stuff to be taken on board the king's ships. It was bitterly cold down there by the sea. Little waves chopped round the harbour wall like dogs jumping up to snap at us. "Get off to the Lion now, you boys, and help unload," a deckmaster shouted. Nick jumped lightly down into one of the little boats. I couldn't follow him. All my terror of the sea welled up again. The waves threw themselves up at me, ready to suck me down into themselves. Again and again they came for me, clawing at me with fingers of spray. I backed away, miserable with fear, and one of the sailors shoved me in the back. Get on, get on." I knew I had to make the hardest journey of my life, to take that step that left the land behind me, and to trust myself to walk above the sea. My hands were sweaty with fright. I closed my eyes. "Help me, Matthew," I whispered inside my head, and I heard a voice floating up to me. "Onward, ever onward." I jumped and landed on all fours in the rocking little boat and looked up to see Nick grinning at me. In no time we were out of the harbour and into the full swell of the waves. The nearer we drew to the king's ships, the huger they seemed, like timber castles rising out of the water. We could see the great blunt stern like a wall of wood, and the lines of cannons nosing out of the hull, and the slope of the tumble home, and the fancy bulstrades and the galleries. We could see the red and white flags of St. George already fluttering from the main mast, and the banners twitching from the two shorter masts. We could hear them flapping, even over the muttering of the waves and the screaming of the girls. They reminded me of horses at the joust, pawing the ground, eager to be off. I was as excited as Nick, too excited to be afraid anymore, and I didn't need the snarling sailor behind me to urge me up the rope ladder to the deck of the Lion with a lash of a rope. He made me yell out loud, but it was with excitement as much as with pain. "A snail would do better. We've got a tide to catch and it doesn't wait for the likes of you," he growled, and I levered myself out of the little boat and scrambled up the ladder, hand over fist. I had done it. I had really done it. I turned to see Nick grinning at me, and I knew I would never be afraid of the sea again. Boatload after boatload, the courtiers and their servants came, shuddering with cold in spite of their fancy fur cloaks. And after came the king's soldiers, boat after boat, till there were so many people crammed on board that if a fish had leapt and landed on the deck, we would have sunk. The tide was right. The sea was silver with morning light. Our great ship, the Lion, was ready to sail. The little tugs rowed us out to sea. The men heaved on the ropes and the sails were hoisted, with much flapping and straining until they bellied out like huge birds' wings. The king's flags and banners were streaming wide now, bright as peasants' tails. The ropes creaked and all the timbers growled like snoring dogs. The little tugboats slipped their towing ropes and danced right backwards around towards land. Our ship cut through the waves, and cold, rainy sprays showered over us all. I ran to the side and looked across the water at our sister ship, the Sweepstake. Her painted prow gleamed golden in the sun as she cut through the waves. Her full sails billowed. Dozens of little painted barges sailed with us, surrounding us, blazing with colour and dancing on the waves. "Isn't this a grand sight?" Nick said behind me. "Like a charm and a flock of goldfinches. Even better, like angels they are, every one, and we must be in heaven." Well, King Henry would love to hear you saying that, I thought, seeing as he thinks he's God. But I daren't even whisper it out loud. My shoulders were still smarting from the sailor rope. I didn't want to give anyone else an excuse to strike me again. I looked out at the boats, skimming as if they were alive on the water, creatures of the sea. And suddenly, out of nowhere, the answer to one of Brother John's riddles came into my head. "Got it! Got it!" I shouted. "What?" "Tell me, Nick. I have no sight nor hands, many ribs, a mouth in my middle. I move on one foot. I am swift as the wind. What am I?" "What are you? You're a boy, same as me." He stared at me, puzzled, and I wanted to laugh, but I held it back. "Of course you got sight. You can see me, can't you?" "Get moving," a sailor shouted. "There's some barrels we need lashing down. No time to admire the view. We've got 6 hours sailing ahead of us if the wind's kind." The wind wasn't kind. The wind was full of treachery that day, and soon after we left Dover and the gleaming white hills behind us, it tossed our boat about like a child's toy. But before it really took hold of us, before it threatened us with a cold swim, my day was spoiled by something far worse than wind or storm, thunder or lightning. Nick and I were scrubbing on our hands and knees on the deck. Some barrows were rolling loose, and he and I were the only ones small enough to scramble behind them and tighten the ropes again. A group of young courtiers strolled past us while we were crouching down there. All I could see from my tight corner were their legs, smart and coloured hose and fancy leather shoes. I could hear their voices. They were jesting together about the king's castle in France and how beautiful the women there were said to be. I know for a fact there's a pretty young goose called Marjorie's flown over there this year, one of them said. I stared. They were talking about my sister. And then came over another voice, one that I knew. We could soon pluck her feathers. They laughed, and I went cold and sick inside. I ducked my head lower, and when they had passed, I turned slightly so I could look up. One of the courtiers was thinner and taller than the others. He was holding his cap in his hand so his wind wouldn't take charge of it. His flapping hair was the colour of candle wax. There was no doubt about it. It was Percy Howard. I sat back on my heels and groaned. Will? Nick asked. I couldn't put a voice to my ego and wretchedness. Tell me, he insisted. I've seen this person who put my father in prison, the Duke of Norfolk's nephew, Percy Howard. He came snooping round our hall and then he betrayed us to the king. And did you hear what he just said about my sister? I've got my knife, Nick whispered. Now drive it between his shoulder blades. I knew he meant it, and part of me wanted to cheer him on too, to see the end of Percy Howard, who hated me so much. But I shook my head. Kill Norfolk's nephew and in front of his friends? You're mad, Nick. You'd be thrown overboard, and so would I. Even so, my hand curled round the dagger at my belt. And if he sees you here, what do you think he'll do to you? He'll have you tied up and stowed below till you can join your father. Let me do it now. He'll never recognise me, surely, I said. Not like this. I remember the way I used to walk past the lower status people at the palace. They were nothing. I never looked them in the eye, unless they were among my servants. They had nothing to do with me. Someone like Percy Howard would never even notice a common ship's boy. He might know me by my red hair, but I had my cap pulled well down to cover it. The only thing he might recognise me was my voice, just as I had recognised his. If I kept quiet, he would never know me. It was better that way. Yet because of him I had lost my home and my father. It would mean nothing to him if the King Henry's soldiers found me and threw me on a bonfire when we reached Calais. Why should I care what happened to him? Why should I spare his life when he had ruined mine? But I did care what happened to Nick. He would die, there was no doubt about it, if he did anything to a member of King Henry's court. So I dropped my hand away and my dagger stayed where it was. I put my hand on Nick's arm and he left his own hand fall from his belt. And it was then that the wind turned. The sea became a foaming beast, lunging and rearing, slamming the line from side to side, nearly tipping us overboard each time as we slid across the wet deck. And all those noblemen tricked out in their finery to greet the new queen were as sick as dogs. I saw Percy and his peacock flock of courtiers crawling to the side of the boat and clinging to the ropes. Their servants could do nothing to help them because they were in the same wretched state. Nick and I were too busy to be ill, and maybe we didn't have any rich food in our bellies to bring up. The immense sky was black and fierce. Day had turned into night. Green water streamed across the deck through the gun ports and washed this way, that way, whichever way the wind heaved the ships. The sailors hauled on the ropes and loosened the sails and tightened them again, and we were yelled at to give a hand, for God's sake, or we'd be under the water. Nick screamed with excitement through it all. A sailor! A sailor! I'm a real sailor! He shouted. God bless the wind and the waves! God bless the sea! And just as suddenly as it had come, the storm dropped to a fine breeze, and the wind blew us steadily on course again. The wretched courtiers lay slumped on the deck, their faces as white as codfishes. If I didn't despise Percy so much, I would have felt sorry for him. One of the young courtiers with him saw me lifting and shouted over to me, Boy, fetch me some ale to spill. My mouth tastes like stale cheese. His friends all laughed feebly. I called back that I didn't know where the ale was kept. Don't speak to me like that, dog, the boy snapped. Sir, I am not your servant, I said angrily, and turned away. I regretted it instantly. I was too late. He was on his feet and feeling for his jewelled dagger. But Percy was there first. He grabbed me by the shoulders and swung me round and stared me into my face. I tried to look down, but he cut my chin in his hand and tilted my head back. I know your voice, he said. I know your face, grubby as it is, and your hair like a mat of dirty red wool. He knocked my cap off and tugged me by my hair till my face was right against his. I shook my head, not daring to say anything else, and Nick slid up to us across the wet deck and tried to pull me away. "Leave me alone," he shouted. "If you know him, you know me too. We're brothers. Our father's a ferryman at Westminster Steps. We've rowed you across the Thames many a times, haven't we, Peter?" Percy stared at me and let me go away, so I dropped back onto Nick's arms. Then Percy staggered as a new turn in the wind brought the boat up onto its elbows, and he launched himself back to the ship's side, groaning and clutching his stomach. "I wish I could die," he moaned. "Amen," whispered Nick in my ear.